You guys should all have sort of a painting that's ready to go, right? And this is, I think, you guys have seen this in Ray's class, yeah? This painting? So, yeah, essentially we've got a matte painting, and there's been some extensions beyond where some of these layers cut off. And some of these layers, by the way, they're a bit rough in terms of the masking and painting, which is fine. But basically, this is the full image, and we're going to set this up in Maya for what's basically known as a 3D matte painting projection. So instead of actually having objects with UVs, we're going to take a camera view that roughly matches or mimics the perspective of the shot, and from the camera view, it will project, right, or sort of treat the camera plane and project that image onto a surface. And so we're going to build essentially rough additions of the ground plane, of some of the mountain terrain, both foreground, midground, and background, and then have a simple plane for the sky. So the way this often looks, if we're looking at this in 3D, and this is done a lot for film, TV shows, commercials, you know, sometimes you get these planes that are kind of on a slant and it looks really skewed and stretched, but from the camera view it looks fairly correct. It looks fairly real as well. So this is a fairly popular technique used in a lot of feature films. You know, in some cases there's very, very rough primitive 3D meshes that are built, but once you have a good painting, whether it's based on a photograph or you had a really skilled digital painter do a painting, you know, you can project these things onto a scene. So this is how a lot of big you know, massive sets are sort of and establishing shots are kind of built for feature films. So if you've ever wondered, you know, how do they render all that stuff, a lot of times it's really, really very basic mesh, but really good photography, really good painting, you know. So this is, again, in some other cases too, you can have multiple camera views. So I think that's a real terrain. So what's interesting about this is that you can project from 3 different angles, and you can, or multiple angles. So again, this is done without UVs, but it's basically using projection from camera views. And if the mesh itself does have UVs, you can actually take those 3 different or multiple camera projections and bake out or convert from a projected style texture to a UV based texture. That's a more advanced technique we're not going to deal with, but I just kind of wanted to open your eyes to that. And so yeah, a lot of times it winds up being almost just what are called cards, right, or just layers of a painting. And even things like smoke, mist, atmosphere, these things can just be layered in as almost a 2D effect. So sometimes these are from live footage, sometimes they're rendered from just simple layers in 3D where somebody's, you know, an effects or a particle artist has kind of generated this stuff to fit into the scene. So again, yeah, it's a really fun kind of process. The mesh can be a little sloppy, a little, you know, it's really all about the painting and doing layer separation, right? Okay, so in this case, you know, I've got a pretty decent separation of my layers. So I've got the background layer, all the various foreground, midground layers as well. And the way I'm going to start, I will basically save a version of this, a flattened version of this. Again, to keep things light in Maya, I often prefer to basically save a flattened version. I usually like to work with TIFFs just because they're very versatile. You can actually have what's called a high bit depth image, basically meaning it could have an immense amount of color range. And I'm also going to turn off layers. So I don't want the Photoshop layers. I want a flattened version of this, right? So kind of a complete version of the painting. So I'll save this. I've got it in my assignment 5 camera projection folder. So I'll hit save for the flattened version. Again, I usually turn off the layers option in the Photoshop window. You often get a second window which asks you if you want to compress the image. Again, I usually want to make sure discard layers is on and image compression is set to none. So I'll do that. So that'll be my simplified flattened version I can use in Maya. And then I'm going to go to File, Export, Layers to Files, right? So Export, Layers to Files. So that'll bring this up. It's actually pretty smart. It'll find the folder that this was opened from, it's going to ask for a prefix or a starting name. The main thing I'm going to do today is, at least in Photoshop, is convert the separated layers into essentially an alpha for Maya. So when I want to separate the individual pieces, I'm going to export them essentially as just alphas. So I can take the complete image and cut out the portions that I need to put onto my kind of rough mesh. So I'm going to go type in alpha underscore. So that'll be the prefix. If you had certain layers or groups turned off, you can turn that option on. So there might be some junk stuff there that you don't necessarily want to have on. In this case, I'm using all the layers. Again, TIFF uncompressed is fine. If I ever use compression, by the way, I tend not to use compression just because, again, certain 3D software, Maya being one of them, can be a little bit touchy with image compression in a TIFF. Also, if you use JPEG compression, you actually lose quality, so I tend not to want to do that, right? As a professional, you want to basically try to make sure you're using maximum quality. Zip and LZW. LZW is an abbreviation of the name of the scientist who came up with the math for this, but both Zip and LZW are what are called lossless compression, so it shrinks file size but keeps all the pixel information, all the color information. The only problem with this is that every time Maya or any other 3D software may need to load this, it actually has to decompress the image and load it. So that actually takes time. So oftentimes it's best just to kind of leave it uncompressed. So I'm going to hit run. This will separate the layers out, right? So right now I'm just doing this essentially to get the file names and the organization done for me in a quick fashion, right? My next step is, I actually don't need the ground plane, so let me find the ground plane. Yeah, I'll leave that, I think, as is for now. That's okay. So I'm going to turn off ground plane and add a new layer. I'm going to fill this thing with black. So I use a lot of shortcuts, and for me, I tend to do, if I do a lot of photoshopping, it's usually masking, layer masking, that sort of stuff. So if you have your color swatches here on the left, right, the lower left, your default color swatches are black and white, but if they're different or if you've changed them to some other colors, you just quickly do that. So let's say we've got something like this, right? If you hit D on your keyboard, it will set that back to black as the foreground, white as the background color. And if you hit Control Backspace, that will fill. So let me just isolate that layer. So Control Backspace fills with the background color. If I hit X on my keyboard, you guys probably know that swaps your foreground background color. So I can hit, again, Control Backspace to fill with the black. Normally when I'm making, so I'm basically going to process each layer for an alpha, right? I'm going to essentially fill that layer. Usually the area you don't want to see would be in black, and the area you want to preserve or see would be in white. But mine's a little different in this sense, so it prefers the area that's going to be isolated to be black and the area that's going to be hidden to be white. So I'm going to make a white background. And to load the selection of the painting, so you can see there's kind of a gradient fade on this. If I control click on this area, I'll have the clouds there, but when I hit control, so again, I'm going to swap my colors and hit Control Backspace. You see I maintain that kind of gradient. So this will, so that's a little trick. If you've got layers with transparent pixels like this, right, I can control click on that layer to get that selection loaded. And it even loads the kind of transparency changes in that layer as well. So it's kind of ingenious in a way. So I'm going to start saving this out. I'm going to have to do this layer by layer. So I'm going to go, what is that, my sky, right? So I'm going to click on the sky, alpha sky, and just simply hit save. I'll turn off layers again. Hit save, and it's just going to simply save over that. I'll say OK. So I'll do the same thing with the background. So I'm going to make it visible, control click on it, and control backspace. Let me just see what's going on there. There's a little bit of a white patch here too, and I'm not sure. Is this? Yeah. Getting a couple of weird results I'm noticing. So I may just invert my selection and make sure that's filled with white. Yeah, you can sort of see there's a little bit of roughness in this particular layer, so I might just clean up this mask. And in some cases, I've noticed on some of the projects yesterday, you know, there were some rough edges, or somebody had like a really blurry area around a tree that they had masked or that they had painted, and so they had to go in and sort of touch up the alpha version of that to really get in and around the leaves. So sometimes you may have to do a little bit of touch up on your alphas to get a better selection, a better result. So again, I'll save this as a TIFF. This is the, yeah, this layer here. We'll save over that. So in this case, I just did a little bit of touch-up painting on that. By the way, if you want to avoid saving over your original PSD separated layers, what you can do is right-click your file, go to Properties, and then make sure you set it as read-only, so you do not accidentally save over your completed painting. Or what I often do, you know me, I will often save numbered versions. So I'll say camera projection layers 01, 02, 03, right? So I always have kind of a backup. Anyway, so a lot of this sort of process will get a little repetitive, so I'll try to make that as painless as possible. I'm going to fill with black, and again, you can see all the kind of transparency of that layer gets converted into that selection. Let me just touch up the mask there. And this sort of stuff too, you know, a lot of the painting, sometimes you can get away with what's called junk masking. So some of the stuff that's maybe below the cutoff point can be a little rough. Sometimes you have to extend out the painting so that when you do a camera move in 3D, you know, you don't want to see the gaps between the layers. And I think Ray's kind of talked to you guys about that, right? Extending the painting beyond, underpainting, I think, right, would be the term. So I'm not the painting expert. I'm more the the 3D expert in this case. So yeah, we'll keep going with this stuff. There we go. Alt Control S. So that's my other shortcut I use a lot. Alt Control S is save as. And yeah, I can quickly save this stuff out. Yeah, there is a way. I don't know if you guys have learned how to use Photoshop Actions, but basically you can go, let me go to Windows, there's this thing called Actions. I could have actually recorded, so I could create a new set of actions, call it whatever, you know, matte painting alphas, record the steps of one layer, and then just duplicated it, automate it basically. So you go File, Automate, Batch, you'd pick the action. So I don't have that saved. But in this case, I'm doing it manually because, like I said, there might be touch-up to do. I want to make sure I'm looking very carefully at each mask as well to make sure I get a decent result. So yeah, there are times though, if you know you've got a good painting, or if you've been really thorough about your painting and your masking, you can actually record a series of actions and then just let it run through, right? So I'd have to organize these layers into a separate folder, and then I'd tell it to run those actions. So the white background would stay right in a separate folder, and then in these things they'd kind of process through and just convert all these to sort of black. You know, so it'd load the selection, fill with black, right? Yeah, and automating, again, it's really, really useful. It just speeds up the whole process. Okay, so that's kind of it. You know, again, there might be situations where I would look at this and say, oh, you know, I got to touch up the mask a bit on this layer, but I can always come back to that later. So we'll go into Maya. So first thing you want to do before you get into Maya, you want to take your flattened version. I may just check the properties on this if I can see them, details. So in this case, I've got a 1280 by 720 image, which is pretty standard. So what I want to do is make sure my render settings are set that way. So go Render Settings. By the way, I may set this up a bit further down the road too, because I will need to render a sequence at some point. So I can, just in preparation for that, if you want to do that now, that's not a problem. You can save a JPEG sequence. Again, if I were doing something more for a film or commercial, I would do probably a TIFF sequence, a Targa sequence, or even something higher quality like, I'm not sure if it's listed in here. There's EXR formats and HDR formats, which are really high quality, but so yeah, maybe I'll just say TIFF for now. TIFF is good. There we go. So I'll scroll down and then switch to 720, HD 720. I've noticed a few students, they have paintings that are not typical HD proportions. So in that case, you'll have to switch to custom and then manually enter in your own numbers. Okay. So just be aware of that. You want to punch in the same resolution that you're going to have in your painting. So that's set. Next up in my perspective view, I'm going to go to View, Image Plane, Import Image. And I'll grab the, oh, before I do that, I should actually set my project. So you're going to go File, Set Project. I'm going to select my Assignment 5 folder, so I'm going to double click on that and hit Set. I'll say Create Default Workspace. Go to Project Window, so I can create my subfolders in there and organize this correctly. So I'll say Accept. So now my folder will have this populated with all the folders I need. So when you're loading textures and stuff, especially for this, the alphas, the base plane, I'm going to drag that into source images. And you will have to render an image sequence at some point, which I believe will dump it into the images folder. Or possibly movies. I got to double check that. But so again, I usually go Set Project, Project Window to create the subfolders. I usually have to go back to Set Project just to make sure that it's pointing to the right source. And then I should save a version of this right away. So I'll just call this, map projection. And I'll put an underscore just for my own ease of viewing here. Save scene as. Okay, so now I'll go View, Image Plane, Import Image, right? And I'll grab my full image, open that up. And essentially what I'm doing right now is just adjusting my camera and looking at the grid. Now, since a lot of you guys have landscapes, and this is this is another issue that's come up a few times with other teachers, is that a lot of you guys tend to just, when you create a camera for shots in your film or for renders, you tend to just leave the default focal length of 35 millimeters. So if I click on my camera, there's a focal length. So the focal length is actually directly tied to what's known as the angle of view. It's the number of degrees of width you can see. A lot of landscape photography is actually shot at 28 millimeters and below. So if we take a look at something like this, focal length, there's a pretty good image here on Google. So what that kind of means is, right, if you shoot with a higher millimeter lens, that basically means you're zooming in. So if the camera's at a locked position and we're looking at this kind of area, the lower the millimeters, the wider the angle of view. So human view is typically considered around 50 millimeters, which means you've got 45-degree range of view. So right out to your peripheral vision, that's kind of the limits of your peripheral vision or what you can visually absorb, right? 35 millimeters is kind of just a generic standard in Maya and in a lot of 3D software. And so if you're at the same position, you zoom in, what happens is you're getting closer and closer visually to a certain part of the image from the same distance to that object, but you're also flattening things. So you're actually losing perspective the more you zoom in, right? And in typical, like I said, typical landscapes start at around 35, but I think a lot of them are more like a 28, 24, or 20 millimeter lens. 14 millimeters gets pretty low, and it starts to approach something like a fisheye lens. Right, and you guys have seen this. So a fisheye lens can sometimes be like a 12 millimeter lens to like a 7 millimeter lens, right? So you get this extreme distortion and warping. So you've almost got like too much perspective, right? It warps the shape of what it captures, you know? It's a cool look for snowboarding and skateboard videos. So yeah, anyways, my point on that is we want to basically try to break away. I mean, if this is a 35 mil lens, great. I suspect it was probably shot with around a 24 to 28 millimeter lens. So I'm going to set this at 28 millimeters. For those of you that have objects that are, you know, some of you might have like a little building, a little house in your scene. What you want to do is actually kind of match the perspective to that, or create a box, then rotate around, try to get it roughly to line up with, you know, maybe the sides of the building or the height of the building. And then if it's not in the right perspective, you have a much clearer time of, you know, do I set the focal length higher? Do I set it lower? And if you just Alt right click and drag, you know, you're kind of dollying in and out. So that can kind of help as well. So I'm going to kind of look at, you know, there's a bit of a road here which gives me a little bit of a clue in terms of perspective. You know, I can get a decent feel for the sense of perspective. So this is kind of high angle, so, you know, the camera's looking down at the grid. So I think, yeah, let me get a bit of a feel for this. So I'm kind of looking at the road here. There's a semi-straight stretch of road there, and I'm kind of lining up my grid with that. And that sort of feels correct to me. So what I'm going to do right away is go to View, Create Camera from Selected, or you can learn the shortcut, right? Control-Shift-C. So I'm going to create camera view from selection. Double-click on that and call it cam_projection. So this is important too. This camera actually, once you've kind of settled on your focal length of the camera, and once you believe you've got the perspective down pretty correctly, you want to basically lock this. The reason being is that once we start building like temporary objects that are planes and basic mesh, the projection or the texture and the way it sits on those mesh, it has to stay in a fixed position. Otherwise it starts warping the texture. So first thing I'll do right now is just create a plane. Pretty much just scale the crap out of this thing. I want to make sure I get coverage here, so I'm going to maybe pull this a bit forward. Maybe extend it a little bit back as well. And I should turn on my, let's do frame gate here. And we want, yeah, the resolution gate. So now you've probably seen me do this before as well. I'm going to click on the projection camera. I usually don't like to see the masking kind of crop in so much. So my little trick for this is to go to display options in the camera, and I'm going to just set the overscan to 1. So I get the full width of my view. I often want to maximize my workspace. So I'll turn off the grid as well at this point. I just want to kind of get a look at things. Okay. So first things first, I'm going to just delete my history on this thing. Now, keep in mind, whenever you start a Maya scene, the Lambert 1 material is sort of a default material. So I often, right away when I start, I don't want to use the Lambert 1 material. I want to start assigning unique materials to each and every piece that I create. So I'm going to go to right-click, Assign New Material. I'll pick a new Lambert. And then I'm going to load what will be my ground plane. So I'm going to click on the little checker next to color. And then I'm going to right-click File. So instead of just clicking File, I'm going to right-click File. And this is a very important step. So for every color file image you load, for every alpha that you load to cut out parts of the mesh, you're going to go right-click Create as Projection instead of just left-clicking on it. Okay, so that's pretty much the key step to this whole process of building this stuff in 3D. So I'm going to say Create as Projection. So right away it opens up the kind of projection node, and there's a little option for you to load your file. Before I get to that, actually, you know what, maybe I'll do that first. I'll click on this, click on the little file icon, load my ground plane, hit open, and then I'm going to step back out here. So step back up to the node, and let me hit 6. So I'll go to my viewport for a second, hit 6. So right now you can see it's trying to project this in a planar way. I'm not sure which direction it's coming from, but if I switch this first of all to perspective, it shifts that. Doesn't look great yet. I go to projection attributes right below that, link to camera projection. Ta-da! So we want to match the, yeah, I believe it's the resolution gate. So let me just hit 4 so I can go from wireframe. So 4 to 6, 4, 6, 4, 6. Yeah, I think in this case I'm going to try film gate here. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think resolution gate's a little better. So let's go back in. Yeah, resolution. Sorry, film gate. There we go. So let's step back out into perspective. Right, so what's basically happening here, let me as well, I think I'm going to have to turn off my image plane for a second. So to turn off your image plane, you just want to grab your perspective view, and we can just simply, in the display node under image plane shape, we can go from RGB to none, just so I can get a look at this. So what's happening, you can see your camera here, right? And I've locked it, which is nice, so I can't accidentally move it. So it's actually looking at it from a point of view and projecting that image onto the surface. So in a way, this is basically like a UV-less texturing system. Okay, so let's go back here. We'll set the image back on. Actually, it's going a little goofy here, so let me go back in. I might have to reload the image. There we go. I'm going to have to undo. One thing I want to mention too, let me just undo something here. So if you notice too, my ground plane is kind of being cut off a little bit. So if I switch back to perspective, let me just jump back to my perspective view. You can sort of see, right, there's the camera, and then it's kind of projecting. This is the image plane, by the way. So what you can do is if you grab the image plane, if it's too close to your scene and you're working on a really large scale scene, what you want to do, I'm just going to temporarily collapse this image plane attributes and go to placement and depth. So if you're working on a very large scale scene, you might want to increase the depth to, let's say, 10,000 from 1,000. And if you take a look, it's pushing it way further back in space. Actually, I'm kind of losing it because of my clipping plane now. So let me click on the perspective camera, right? Far clipping plane, I'll just set it to like 100,000. So there, you can now see it's pushing it way further back. So but it scales it too, so it keeps it in proportion. So when I'm looking through the camera map projection, I still see the exact same image, but now I've got more depth to kind of play with, right? So I can probably build this on a bit more of an appropriate scale. So I'm going to just bring this up. So yeah, this thing, I've got the, and I've labeled the texture ground, by the way. So it's always a good idea to label your textures when you create them. So in here I've got the color, everything's set up to the film gate resolution, and I've loaded my my TIFF. Okay, so next step. Now you can either duplicate this, create a new plane. I might move this plane just down a little bit. I'll scale it a bit more in depth here and pull that out a bit more. And then I might hit H just to hide it, because now I want to make the next plane. So I'll hit G, create a new plane. I'm just going to scale this thing up. I believe the next section, if I just jump back to Photoshop for a minute, will be this kind of foreground. Let's take a look at that. Sort of this little patch here, right? So I kind of just, again, I need just enough coverage for that. And you can hit 4. This is one of the beautiful things about the image planes. You can hit 4 to go to wireframe, so you can sort of see what you're doing through that mesh. Yeah, I could leave this resolution. Sometimes I drop it just to work really simply, and then maybe I'll smooth it. In this case, I'm going to go to Sculpt, and using a sculpting brush. Let me go back to 5 here. Ooh, it's a little too much. So I'll adjust my strength here, maybe to like 4. So let's go back here. Kind of just get this little patch that's kind of raised up on the surface. All right, so we actually get some depth to this. There. So it kind of feels okay, you know? It's not too bad. Okay, I might just do a little bit of smoothing on the back end there. There. So I'll go back to 6 to preview my texture. I'm going to hit Alt-Control-D, by the way, to clear my history. This thing still has the Lambert 1. So remember, like I said, you don't want to change the default. I'm going to right-click, Assign New Material. go to Lambert. And I should rename it right away, so I'll call this low L for left, foreground. We'll click on this. Again, right click, create file as projection. So instead of just clicking file, it's always a right click, create as projection. Again, we switch from planar to perspective. Link it to our projection camera, and resolution gate should be fine. So let's hit 6 on the keyboard. Now again, nothing's showing up because I haven't actually loaded the image itself. So I'm going to click on the image node. Left foreground. There we go. Actually, sorry, before I do that, I'm actually just loading the base projection on every single piece. So that should load any second. There we go. And I need to cut out parts of this ground plane, right? So to do that, I have to then go into transparency, click on that, and right click, create as projection. Again, I have to switch this from planar to perspective. I'm just matching everything the same way. Camera shape, match film gate, and when I go in here, so this is the alpha part, right? So when I start actually having elements above the ground plane in the background, I basically have to start, and this is a highly repetitive process, so I'm going left foreground, right? Open that up, and it cuts out. So let me jump back to perspective so you can see that. Let's hit F, so check that out, right? It's projecting it from that view onto that surface, right? So it looks correct. Now there is a limitation, so let's say I start doing a camera fly-through. I'm going to just do a quick test on this, and it'll be similar to what I would do in the finale. For this project, I would take my camera projection, go view, create camera from view. So I'm basically making a clone. I'm going to click on this and call it fly through, or fly is fine, cam fly. Go to view, unlock. So I want to make sure I'm looking through the fly camera, and as I pull through, now I can do a camera move. So that's going to be the point of this, is to break up a 2D painting, project it onto 3D surfaces, right? Mind-blowing, yeah? It's pretty cool. And it looks so realistic, right? It gives you such a great feeling of depth and perspective. And it gives you that, it's, you guys have probably learned this in maybe like life drawing class, parallax, right? There's foreshortening, there's parallax, which is basically when the background moves slower than the foreground. So you're getting these real perspective cues for this matte painting move, basically. Alright, so I'm going to just delete that camera because I don't really need it anymore. I'll come back to creating that projection camera though, or the fly-through camera. So I'm going to unhide the ground plane too. So I'm just temporarily unhiding this. Let's go back to perspective. So check that out, right? Usually I want my ground plane to be in contact with the object. I don't want there to be a gap because then you're going to have this floating thing, right? So I'm going to raise this up so that there is more solid contact between those pieces. And again, sometimes I sculpt this stuff in or out a bit depending on the situation. So let's go back to the cam view, and I may need to pull this forward because I'm losing some coverage at the bottom there, right? So I'm going to just play around with that a little bit to make sure I get a decent amount of coverage. And this is all, you know, it's all really rough. It's not super accurate, but it just needs to be good enough, you know? So I always try to maintain solid contact between objects, especially in the foreground elements. In the midground and background, a lot of times they'll just be like flat planes. So again, I'm going to hit H to hide the ground plane for a sec. I'm going to go to polygons, maybe create a new plane, scale that sucker up. And in this case, I'm going to rotate it so it's a bit on a slant. So this, I'm going to take care of the cliffs on the right side. So I'm going to keep it on this sort of angle. Maybe even rotate a little bit this way. And I'm going to reduce this. So this one I want to be really, really basic to start. So I'll go to polyplane and just do like a 4x4. Whoa. What happened there? That's some bizarre stuff. That's a new wrinkle. That shouldn't happen. Shouldn't happen. Again, my mind's, I think, being a little bit weird today. A little bizarre. So I'm going to just create a new plane right off the bat. I'll start over, do a 4x4 plane right away, And then I think if I scale this guy up, it should be, yeah, it's okay. For some reason, it didn't like it after I moved it. It's really bizarre. So let me just move this over, scale it down a little bit. I'm going to rotate it because it is kind of receding into the background in a sense, and I want to get that, again, I'm kind of matching perspective of the object itself. So what's cool about this too, let me just, maybe with the scale tool, usually with scale and move tool, I like this to be in object mode, so it's following the orientation of the object itself. So object for both move and rotate. There we go. So I can scale it. So yeah, it's basically, it's a card that's going to pick up a projection from the camera view, from its perspective, assign new material. Very repetitive process, right? Right click the Lambert, or sorry, not right click, but I'm going to assign a new Lambert. Oops, make sure we get that Lambert on there. Rename this, so this will be, what did I say? Lower R for right, foreground. A lot of times you want to kind of like name things straight ahead so that it's easy to identify them, easy to go and locate them. So we'll go create as projection, perspective, camera shape projection, match film gate, go into your file node. Again, I'm going to load my base painting. So that's the camera projection. Step back out, go to transparency, right click, right, same exact thing, create as projection, perspective, cam shape, step into the image node, and then, what is this? Sorry, yeah, right foreground. Okay. Oops, is that right? Sorry, I loaded that in the wrong spot. Let me try that again. So you have to go into actual transparency. There we go. Create as projection, perspective, cam shape, and then go into the image node. There we go. So that shape is roughly there. Now I could leave this as a card, right? Again, I might go back and let's go back and create camera view. There we go. So a lot of times I like to test this as I go, so I'm going to just actually leave my geez, what's going on? There we go. There's my projection again. So I'll go back to the fly cam, which is an exact copy, but I'm going to unlock that copy. So this might be a good actual opportunity to save as, just in case something goes a little haywire again, like it did a little while ago. Go to 3, save as. And again, yeah, this is the fly cam. I want to make sure I'm looking through the fly cam, and now we can sort of get that sense of perspective. You know, there's still a bit more work to be done on, so yeah, let's go back to the projection view. So it's very important, the projection camera cannot move, right? Because that's the thing that's actually placing the texture on the surface. So yeah, with this thing, you know, a lot of times I'll go in and maybe with soft selection or something, I'll go in and start kind of shifting. And this might be easier done in perspective, actually. So I'll shift around in perspective and say, oh, you know what? Let me take this edge and start to pull it around and back. Keep in mind, you don't want to cut off the image. You just want to sort of shift it into position. Maybe this needs to be lowered a little bit. Maybe I'll bring that a bit further out. Again, it's got to pick up that whole patch, right? So that it's covering the area. So this is what I mean, you know, sometimes we can use really, really rough shapes. You know, sometimes I'll manipulate this a little bit. Actually, I'll go to object mode and hit Control 1 just so I can isolate this. This is also pretty useful. So what's great about this too is, you know, you can go in and start just roughing up the shape a bit. So if I go vertex, right, I can manipulate the shape so it flows more with the edge of this overall kind of mountain cliff region. So that way I get a bit more of this kind of wraparound effect that I sort of want. Like so. So we kind of get the ground plane receding more into the background. Right, so this will just kind of exaggerate the feeling of depth. And if I go back to projection, object mode. Let's make sure we can see the texture. Hit Control 1. I'm going to go back to my fly camera, right? So now, if I unlock that, right? Now you can see it just feels like it's got so much more depth. And if I unhide the ground plane, yeah, I might need to warp the ground plane down on this side too. So, you know, sometimes it's a little bit of a balancing act between some of the elements here. Let's try this. Yeah, let's drop this down a little bit. So, you know, something a little strange about this. I feel like maybe my ground plane might actually be a little too high. So let's drop that down. So one of the other beautiful things too is you can really quickly adjust these shapes, you know. So let's pull that down. So yeah, I'm gonna have to move this down and over, like so. I may just scale this up a little bit. Okay. All right, so let's go back to the fly cam. Okay, that's not too bad. All right, back to projection. So I'll try to just wrap up. I'll do a couple of the background planes. These are usually pretty straightforward because they're so far in the distance, right? They're usually very, very simple, flat kind of cards. And again, I don't need a ton of resolution on this stuff, so I'll just set this to 4x4. I'll scale this roughly appropriately to the background here. Let's shove that thing way off in the distance. Again, I often like to see this in perspective just so I get a sense of scale in the scene. And it's the image itself. It's really the... So since these are mountains, I'm going to put them on a bit of a slope as well. So I'm going to kind of rotate them on this angle, which again will kind of help with this sense of perspective, of scale. Okay, let's do that. So we're going to assign new material, Lambert, and we'll call this BG Mountains. Okay. So right click, create as projection. Again, super repetitive at a certain point. We'll go projection shape. Let me just make sure I'm in my projection camera. And then we'll load that background. So actually I want the full projection. Let's step back out. And then we'll go to transparency. Again, same thing. Right click, create as projection, scene. There we go. Okay. So I should make sure, I think I'm getting some weird distortion. So I'm going to just make sure I think I made a little misstep here. I was setting this to film gate when I should be going probably camera resolution. I think that'll give me something a little more accurate. So I'm going to try to make sure everything is setting up correctly here. So I have to do that for both the color and the alpha to make sure that they match. Okay. So resolution, I believe I'm on resolution gate. Yeah. Camera shape. Let's see. Film gate, resolution gate. There we go. So now if we take a look again back in perspective, right, this is sort of what we've got going on. And if you really want to get fancy, you know, you can go in and say, oh, maybe this kind of area pops out a little more. You know, it's got a little bit more depth to it, and you know, you can add more resolution here if you want, just to kind of give it, again, a little bit of an extra sense of depth and sort of dimensionality to it. Okay, so back to projection. I haven't done all the elements. There's a couple of other plates, but I'm going to just try to sort of speed through this because I think you guys are starting to get the point. I'll skip the sort of back part of the mountain here. Yeah, let's see. I think for my ground plane, I'm actually kind of missing part of this lake and stuff, so I'm going to go back and just make sure the ground plane actually extends out far enough to capture that area. So I'm going to just... The beautiful thing about this too, like I said, is you can just scale the ever-loving crap out of this. Yeah, let's go back. I think this thing needs to move forward, right? The mountains need to kind of be covered in a certain area here. So let's scale this down. There we go. It's kind of cool. You can sort of see it pop into existence, right? Also, sometimes what I'll do is I will sometimes just turn off the image plane at a certain point because I just need to, it's sort of a guideline in the beginning, and then after a certain point I want to just sort of see how the matte painting itself is progressing. So let me test this out again with the fly cam. Oops, let's go object mode here. All right, so now we're kind of getting this feeling of moving into the valley, right? Yeah, let's go back to perspective. So yeah, a lot of times there's kind of a little back and forth. We have to check our stuff here. So yeah, I'm going to just warp this a little bit more. Yeah, what I might do as well is cheat this a little bit. So this is kind of like forced perspective on the object. So I'm going to just, again, I want to make sure that there's kind of correct coverage here. Now you can also extend your paintings out, right? So I think Ray talked about this underpainting situation. So this is where I have some gaps, you know. So I can either try to warp the mesh into place to get that fit, or I can try, you know, some additional painting, let's say, to get the coverage. So this is an area where I'm getting some gaps. At this point, I don't want to really deal too much with the painting, so I'm just more or less warping to kind of cover the little gaps in the projection. Again, sometimes a little smoothing helps too. So if I just do a little like mesh preview on some of these parts, it kind of helps sort of give me a little bit of a better blend. All right, so now we can get this little camera motion. So one of the last things to do is get the background. So let's go back to the projection. Oops, let's move this thing over a little bit. Yeah, so let's create a new plane. I'm going to go into the setup here and just make it, again, a simple 4x4 plane. Rotate this sucker, scale it up. Again, I kind of want it roughly parallel to the camera, so I'm going to just try to eyeball that as best I can. And then we'll scale this thing up and wide. We'll push this thing back in space. Scale it across. And again, same process. Assign new material, Lambert. Color, right click, create as projection, and again, we'll set all this up. Projection shape. So yeah, a lot of the issues I've seen, I guess in yesterday's group was, you know, basically it's an issue of there being gaps in some of the planes, or there being weird underpainting issues. So yeah, sometimes you have to extend out the area and extend out the alpha just so you get more coverage, making sure there's connections between some of the planes. like foreground, midground. And then loading the alphas correctly and setting all these options correctly in terms of projection map, picking the right resolution gate. Actually, this one, yeah, I think I'll leave that as is. So I think that's okay for the background. Let's go to the fly camera. Right, so now we get that parallax, right? So the background's moving a lot less than the foreground. So this is what gives it that super real feeling, right? Pretty cool. So I'll talk briefly. It's already been a bit of a long demo, but let me just save this as, save scene as, let's do version 4. So yeah, let's take a look at doing a little rendering. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically pull wide. Now, sometimes if I've screwed with my camera enough, I'll just delete the fly cam and make a new one based on the actual projection camera. In this case, I can get back to a point where it's roughly where it was. So I'm just holding Alt, right-clicking to get back to this kind of establishing wide view. I'm a little bit unhappy with what's happening at the bottom here. Again, I get a little picky with this stuff sometimes, so you know, a professional is almost never satisfied. So let me just tweak that. So I feel like the ground plane here should be right, kind of angling out a little more. So I'm going to just kind of warp that into position so it feels like it's a little more grounded there. Yeah. So yeah, it's good. You know, if something bugs you, you should really try to fix the issue. And actually, you know what? I'm going to isolate this thing as well, just to make it a little easier. There we go. Vertex. And then hit Control 1. There. So again, I do want to establish some context, so I can sort of feel where there's overlap happening or not happening. Yeah. And sometimes this might require that you try to like alter the painting a little bit as well, because there is this kind of slope that's part of this. So I might isolate just the Rocky Mountains and maybe separate this and make it part of the ground plane. So sometimes there's a little bit of touch-up that needs to happen on the painting, but I think this will be okay. Okay, so enough fiddling around with that. What I'll do next is set this up for rendering. So main thing is for you guys, I haven't done the outline yet, but I'm going to put one up very soon. I'm going to just do, I guess I'll just do 120 frames, 100 to 120 frame animation is totally fine. I believe I have auto tangents on, if I'm not mistaken, in animation. So auto key, auto tangents, weighted, that's totally fine, because I just want a camera that's going to slowly accelerate and then decelerate. It's a very simple camera move just for me to see that you've got layer separation in your painting and you've got some of that perspective motion. So I'll take the camera fly, so I'm going to bring it back roughly to where I don't see the edges of the painting and the distortions and all that. So roughly where the camera projection was. This is a free camera, so I should be able to just pretty much grab everything. Right click, key selected. Scrub to the end of the timeline. I'm going to zoom in. Now if you want to, so that's going to auto key. I'm in auto key mode, which is down here, right? That little switch has been turned on. When it's off, it's dark gray. When it's on, it's blue. Now what you may also want to play with as well, I always like these camera moves in general, is you can go in and say, well, maybe I'll make the focal length, oops, not that wide. Maybe I'll make the camera a little bit wider, maybe like 24. So we get this kind of a pull in and maybe a little perspective tweak as well. So that's kind of fun. And if you wanted to, you could reverse the keys where the camera's pulling out, right, instead of pulling in. But for me, this is totally fine. All right, just check it out. Nice, slow, gradual acceleration and then a deceleration. I get a sense of the parallax. Yeah, so that works for me. So what I want to do to set up an animation, I'm going to go to the render settings. I've had some people submit this to me. There's the default format in Maya. I got to find a way to change this, but its default format is an IFF file, which is only readable inside Maya, and it's a pain in the butt to deal with. So again, I tend to go with like TIFF sequences or target sequences. In this case, I just want a simple sequence. So I'll go TIFF. To render sequences, you actually have to switch this as well. Maya will not render a sequence. Even if you go to render sequence in the render settings, you have to actually set it to one of these. Usually the best ones are the name.number.extension or name number extension or name underscore number extension. The number at the end doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense. So this for me is fine. I'm going to set this up. And if you've set up your folders correctly, it will go to your images output, right? And it does an image sequence. So we're going to render a sequence. Rarely in animation in 3D do you want to actually render a complete AVI file or a complete MOV file. You might wonder, well, why is that? Well, what happens if your thing crashes in the middle of the render? You have to go back and render from the very first frame because the AVI file will be corrupted. Whereas with an image sequence, you could say, oh, the render died after 60 frames, so I'll start on frame 61 and continue, right? As you all know, the pain of being a 3D artist is crashes and file corruptions, right? God, I hate my life sometimes. But yeah, no, you want to save a TIFF sequence. Always render an image sequence when possible. And we've got our start and end time. So I'm going to go from frame 1 to frame 120. Okay, so that's the second part of this, rendering a sequence. Want to render the fly cam. And that should be good. I'm going to hit close. I'm going to hit save just in case, so Control S or Control Alt S. Come on, Maya. Why aren't you saving? Let's just, yeah, usually before I render, and oftentimes when I render, I start saving like crazy amounts of files. You want to do a single image test though, so if we just go to our regular render window. By the way, if your image comes out super dark or super light, this could be because of an image correction that's happening on the texture. So if I turn this off, this is pretty much comparable to my, it's coming out a little darker. Mine does some color management, which I don't want to get too far into, but I'm basically just going to switch this off. I think this looks fine off. Okay, so we'll turn that off. Or if you go to your render settings, there's this, it's an option near the top here, which is called Output Transform. So you can, you know, leave it on sRGB if you want. We could try to render this again. There. So that's not terrible. Again, I can switch this off. So to render the actual sequence, this is just the setup for the sequence, but I'm going to go to rendering. Now I'll go to the render tab. Before, in older versions of Maya, we used to go to batch render. Now it's a little more simple and direct. We can actually go with this option, which is called render sequence. So I'm going to go to the settings for that. And basically, I usually just want to say render all layers. And it should render from the active view, the current active view. So I'm going to just say render sequence and close. And you see it's actually going through the timeline. If I check out my output window, it's going to pop up each frame that it's rendering. It tells you how long. Basically, it's less than a second per frame, so this is going to be pretty quick. I'll just pause the video. Yeah, this is a little weird too. I've noticed this as well with the image sequence. I think because it's a newer feature in 2017, it should just dump it directly into the images folder, but for some reason it's putting it into a temp camfly subfolder, so I don't know. I got to look into that, why that's happening, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy that path. I've got Adobe Media Encoder open, so I'm going to say let's create a new encode, paste my path in, open, grab the very first frame. It's going to automatically recognize the TIFF sequence. Say open. I'm going to just double check. So H.264 high bit rate, which I believe is the default encoding, is good. I do want to make sure my frame rate is correct. So yeah, I should. In this case, I may have to manually set it. So right now it just sets it to 29.97. I'm going to just double check my animation settings. I believe by default we've set ours to 24 frames per second, right? So I want this to run at the correct speed. So they've moved all this stuff around. So I think it's under settings. There we go. So 24 frames a second is the frame rate that I animated at, right? So I'm going to have to just uncheck the default setting for this preset and set it to 24. And I think it just exports the default folder here. So I'm going to let it do that. That's fine. So that's what I want from your submission. That'll be step one. We'll let this thing encode. So I'm going to hit play now to actually do the encoding. So I'll let that run through. It's pretty quick. And then I can now double click on the actual MP4 and watch the playback, right? So I've got that nice little camera move, you know, into the valley. There. So that's pretty good. I think one last thing I'm going to ask for, I haven't written the outline yet, but I may just ask you guys to go into your perspective view and show me one of these kind of views, right? What I often will do as well, by the way, I forgot to mention this, as a last step, I should do this before my rendering as well. I should just go into the, click on the image plane, and I think it's under, actually I might have to do this in the camera view, I think. Go to my projection camera, image plane, and image plane attributes, and just set this to none, right? So I don't see that in the background. So what I'd like from you guys is maybe just kind of you can even just do a print screen if you want, or do, you know, viewport 2.0 render, where we just, again, we'll grab the perspective camera, go into the display options, set the overscan to 1. By the way, you can render from viewport 2.0 here as well. So if I just set this back to my hardware 2.0, that's actually viewport 2.0. And if I just do a single image render, right? In this case, I'll turn on the color correction. So now you've got a render that you can just go File, Save Image, right? So I get a view of kind of the layout of your scene. Basically, if I've got images and videos to grade, rather than opening individual My files and relinking textures, it saves me time. And I'm a lot nicer when I grade, when I don't have to open 1,000 files. So, yeah. Do you guys have any questions, or is that good? Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. When I first open the image plane, it's the flattened version, the one that goes into the camera view.
But do you load it as a projection, or do you load it as a...
Well, no, it's just matched to the camera. So,
Okay.
so it's there for me to kind of set the camera angle and the focal length. But that original image is just a reference point. Yeah, it's the flattened version just for the reference. Then after that, once you start building actual mesh, then you start putting real projections onto real planes, real objects. Any other questions?